Leon Panetta 2017 lecture series, The Trump Presidency and the Future of America. This lecture discusses the world, terrorism, Russia, China, populism, and cyber. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Secretary Leon Panetta.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth forum and the final event in the 2017 Leon Panetta Lecture Series. And if you're wondering why there isn't somebody prettier up here, Sylvia pulled a muscle in her back. And for those of you that are familiar with what that means, you know why she's not here. But she did want me to extend her regards, and she's doing well. As we said at our first lecture in March, this year is our 20th anniversary. And as this milestone season comes to a close, I in particular want to thank all of you that have come here and attended these lecture forums. We appreciate your support, and we appreciate your being here. This spring, we've been exploring the Trump presidency. When we selected this theme, we knew that the new administration would bring a very different approach to Washington and to policy. But no one quite anticipated the number and scope of challenges that the White House is facing both here and abroad. In the world, we are seeing a number of dangerous threats. Threats that we have probably not seen since the end of World War II. This spring alone, we've seen a sharp increase in terror attacks, particularly with the tragic events in London, in Baghdad, in Afghanistan. There's a growing aggression from North Korea. There are failed states like Syria and the Middle East that are breeding grounds for terrorism. There are the continuing threats from Iran, the threat of a new arms race and cyber attacks interfering with our election in this country from Russia, instability in Europe as a result of the Brexit vote, and another vote coming up in Great Britain. And a China growing in strength and influence and continuing to make territorial claims in the South China Sea. It is within this environment that President Trump has assumed leadership of the world's only remaining superpower. His recent decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement is just the most recent example that President Trump is transforming America's relationships with traditional allies and testing the strength of long-standing commitments. How does the concept of America First translate into foreign policy? What will be the impact on the global community, on the peace and security of our country, if America does not provide leadership on issues like the fight against terror, on nuclear proliferation, on the protection against cyber threats, and on climate change? Tonight, we'll ask these questions to two of the most experienced foreign policy, national security, and defense experts of our time. Our first guest is a pioneer in foreign policy and global affairs. She served in both Bush administrations. She was in President George H.W. Bush's National Security Council. She was on their staff. She held several positions, including director and Senior Director of Soviet and East European Affairs. She was Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. She joined the administration of President George W. Bush in 2001 as his National Security Advisor. The first woman to hold that position. She served in that capacity until 2005, when she was confirmed as the 66th Secretary of State, becoming the second woman and the first African American woman to hold that post. In these roles, she pioneered a policy of transformational diplomacy and heralded the formation of new global governments based on democratic principles. She has authored and co-authored numerous books, including Extraordinary Ordinary People, a memoir of family, No Higher Honor, a memoir of my years in Washington, and her recent bestseller, Democracy, Stories from the Long Road to Freedom. She earned her BA, her master's, and her PhD, all from the University of Denver, and currently is a professor at Stanford University. Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome Condoleezza Rice. Our second guest used his vast experience in national security, technology, and innovation to defend the United States for more than 35 years. He served as an Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy from 1993 to 1996 and was Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics from 2009 to 2011. In 2011, when I became Secretary of Defense, I chose him to become my Deputy Secretary of Defense, working as the Pentagon's Chief Operating Officer, overseeing the department's annual budget and its 3 million plus civilian and military personnel. Named the 25th Secretary of Defense in 2015, he became known for his leadership and his creativity. He energized the global military campaign against ISIS, designed and executed a strategic pivot to the Asia-Pacific region, established DoD and NATO's new strategy for confronting Russian aggression. He spearheaded revolutionary improvements in technological and operational capabilities, and he launched the latest DoD cyber strategy. For his work, he's been awarded the Department of Defense's Distinguished Service Medal, the highest DoD civilian honor, on 5 separate occasions. He earned his BA from Yale University and his PhD from Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. We are honored to welcome Ash Carter.
Thanks, Cal. Thank you. Welcome. Madam.
Mr. Secretary.
And of course, the moderator of this program is Leon Panetta. Good evening again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Hey. I'm playing a different role. Welcome again to our fourth and final forum of the lecture series, the Leon Panetta Lecture Series for 2017. As you know, we've had this theme, the Trump presidency and the future of America. We've talked about health care. We talked about the economy. Last week we talked about our democracy. Tonight we focus on the world and a number of dangerous threats that face us in today's world. And the issue that we'll focus on is whether the United States will continue to provide what it has done for the last 70 years since World War II, to continue to provide global leadership in that kind of world. Or will we retreat into Fortress America? The dangers that are out there are indeed significant in the sense of which one of these could have us in confrontation from day to day. We are dealing with terrorism and dealing with ISIS and their attacks. We're dealing with all of these failed states in the Middle East. We're dealing with the threat from Iran. We're dealing with Russia. We're dealing with China. We're dealing with North Korea. We're dealing with wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we're dealing with cyber, the new battlefield of the future. In dealing with all of those threats, do we do this alone, or do we do this by building relationships and alliances with our allies throughout the world? That's the kind of issue that we will discuss this evening with two, as I said, very experienced and knowledgeable individuals, both in foreign policy as well as in defense. Let me begin, obviously, by talking about some of the recent events that we've seen happen in both foreign policy and defense policy. We've had these terrible attacks in London. We had the president's 9-day trip abroad. We've had the withdrawal from the Paris Accords. We continue to have his tweets on the travel ban and criticizing the mayor of London. We've also had H.R. McMaster and Gary Cohn, who are members of the administration, who wrote in the Wall Street Journal, and I quote, "The world is not a global community, but an arena where nations, non-governmental actors, and businesses engage and compete for advantage," unquote. David Brooks called that, in his column, "Selfishness is the sole driver of human affairs." Is that true? How would you define Trump's foreign policy? And have we come to an end of the 70-year era of U.S. global leadership? Let me start with you, Condi.
All right, I drew the short straw. Okay. Well, first of all, thanks very much for having us here and to the Panetta Institute for all that you do. So let me start with the issue of American global leadership and the view that the world is a kind of jungle in which everybody competes for advantage. Well, to a certain extent, yes. The notion of an international community has always been something of a fiction. There are countries that are pursuing their interests and pursuing them to the limits that they possibly can. That is absolutely true. The people, though, who designed the system after World War II looked back on the world between World War I and World War II, and they said, no, we're not going to do that again. That was zero-sum game. It was a zero-sum game international economy in which people protected, in which you had beggar-thy-neighbor trading policies, you had violent competition over resources. We can do better. And they created a global order with an international economy that was actually not to be zero-sum game. It was to be one in which everybody, through comparative advantage, could win, and the international economy would grow. It wasn't a fixed pie with everybody just getting their piece. They also had a vision of free peoples as people who would be peaceful peoples. So when they rebuilt Germany, they rebuilt it as a democracy. Japan as a democracy. It's paid off handsomely. And so the American concept of the global order was, yes, it was competitive, but it didn't have to be conflictual. And there could be institutions that helped countries to cooperate. I think in the long run, that is in America's interest. It is in America's interest to have allies. It is in America's interest to work with others toward common goals. Of course we have to defend our interests. But we've always believed that we can defend our interests and our values in concert with others, not necessarily against others, particularly those who share our values. As to the Trump foreign policy, I think it's still evolving. I think it's still emerging. If you look at some of the policies, they're pretty traditional. We've gone back to a one China policy, for instance, after the president wasn't so sure that he believed in one China. Well, we've now restated that. We will get to this, but I think the North Korea policy looks like the North Korea policy would look whoever's in the White House. The Syria policy is one that's actually a little bit now defending the red line that President Obama set. And even the trip to NATO, where there were clearly some missing words in the pledge to an attack upon one is an attack upon all, Article 5, even that trip still demonstrated a president going to NATO, a president saying that this alliance is important to us. So let's see how it evolves. We all know the members of that national security team. They are all extremely capable people. Rex Tillerson at State, Jim Mattis at Defense, H.R. McMaster. And so while some of the notes to the music sound a little bit different, I'm sincerely hoping that ultimately the score will be much the same, because I think that American leadership for 70 years has served us extremely well.
Ash? Oh, I agree with that last part. And just to add to what Condi said, it is important that we stand for things, and we do. But even if you're just thinking about how we get what we want, you get what you want not only with competitive behavior. We also get what we want through cooperative behavior, and alliances are a good example of that. And it's fine to question alliances, and people ought to question alliances, but certainly from the point of view of national defense, they are ways of bringing more firepower and more geography into a circumstance than we would have on our own. And so they add value to us. And Leon, you started out by talking about a fortress America, and there's a fallacy in that concept in my mind. In today's world, there is no such thing as being in America is not a fortress. Once upon a time, the oceans and the heavens constituted a fortress, but in the missile age and the cyber age, that's no longer the case. So we are, in fact, not only less effective, but fundamentally incapable of defending ourselves without some cooperation with at least some part of the world. And I think as far as the new administration is concerned, and the president and President Trump, if we're going to get whatever it is we want over time, clarity and consistency are so important. And that's why Condi's point about consistency, and much of our policy has been consistent over decades and administrations. And that's where we've been most effective. NATO was effective. NATO defended Europe and ended the Cold War. And then it was been effective in Afghanistan. It's actually done things over time. But you need clarity and you need consistency. And to Condi's point about hearing different things from different people, I think the lack of clarity is what I hear most from those overseas. You said, 1 minute I hear one thing from Jim Mattis, or this from Rex Tillerson, but the next minute there's a tweet. And at some point over those need to come together, because without that clarity and consistency, we're not going to get what we want.
Condi, let me ask you just on the Paris Accords, which was obviously a controversial decision. And there's a new poll out, I think, where 60% of the American people were opposed to withdrawing from that agreement. But you were there when President Bush withdrew from the Kyoto agreements as well. What are the consequences of of withdrawing from the Paris Accords?
Well, we did withdraw from Kyoto. We didn't do it very elegantly, by the way, and it shows that early on White Houses tend to be a bit chaotic. I don't care who is there, even if it's somebody who was governor of Texas and was the president's son at one point. They can be a little bit chaotic. But Kyoto was a very different accord. First of all, Kyoto was a set of targets that had been set by the international community, and everybody was supposed to meet them. Secondly, it had gone down 99-0 in a Senate resolution, so it had really no domestic support. And very clearly, getting out of Kyoto had some cost, but I think it was a different kind of agreement than the Paris Accord. The Paris Accord, which, by the way, we need to be careful about apocalyptic language. The Paris Accord was never going to stop climate change and global warming. The United States has, over the last decades, had reversing emissions, and so we have lower emissions. China and India are going to continue to add to the emissions for some time, even under the Paris Accord. But what the Paris Accord was, it was a kind of international ratification of national plans to deal with climate change. And in that regard, I think it had some value, and I would have preferred to see us stay in. It's a national plan for the United States anyway. If we believed that there needed to be adjustments in terms of economic growth, then those adjustments could have been made effectively unilaterally. And I think the cost is that you appear to be saying, we'll go it alone. Now, what I hope is that the United States will now continue to do what we've been doing, which is to find a formula for economic growth, environmental stewardship, and changing energy mix so that we're getting more alternatives in. We're going to be dependent on hydrocarbons for a long time, but we've been on this path. We can continue on this path. Now, one thing that I think is kind of laughable, frankly, and I'll put it very strongly, the idea that China is now going to become the leader in this area. Have you tried to breathe in Beijing recently? We sometimes use language that makes a mockery of a serious point. And if Xi Jinping wants to clean up China, more power to him. I hope he'll do it rapidly, because for the Chinese people and the rest of the world, China needs to stop emitting. China needs to stop building coal-fired plants every week. And that's what they're doing. So again, I would have stayed in. I don't like the apocalyptic language around it, but I think the cost is that people think you're saying you're going it alone.
Ash, let me ask you about defense policy. As you know, he's appointed a number of former military types, many of whom we work with, H.R. McMaster and Jim Mattis, who was head of CENTCOM when I was there, John Kelly, who was my military aide. He's also appointed, as Connie pointed out, other responsible people like Pompeo, Dan Coates, in their intelligence positions, in addition to Rex Tillerson. And he has conducted the limited attack in Syria, as you pointed out, brought the Arab coalition together to fight ISIS. It's been a lukewarm attitude with regards to NATO. But he's strongly supported funds for defense. Is there a difference between U.S. defense policy under President Obama and under President Trump?
Well, let me start with the defense first part, and the defense part first, and the budget. He's made about a 3% proposed increase. Of course, there is no budget, which is a whole other story. But we haven't had a budget in 8 years. All the time I was Undersecretary of Defense, Deputy Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Defense, the Congress hasn't, we've lived on continuing resolutions, the Congress hasn't had a normal budget cycle in all that time. And so whether there'll ever be a budget or not, I don't know. But if it is, and it's his, it'll be 3% larger. I won't tell you that as Secretary of Defense, I don't think we could make good use of another 3%. It's not a huge amount. But I think we could. At the same time, as Secretary of Defense, I was not and didn't believe I could be indifferent to the functions that contributed to our defense that are outside of the Department of Defense. Condi, and her Department of State, case one, much of the intelligence effort, the Energy Department, which supports us with nuclear weapons, which is critical to our security in my judgment, the law enforcement, the FBI, if you talked about terrorist attacks and so forth. So there are a lot of functions that are not in defense that are necessary for protecting ourselves. And finally, I believe that in the long run, Leon, the nation's strength depends on research and development, education. And so I didn't think as Secretary of Defense I could be indifferent to all the other parts of the government as well, even if I did believe that we could spend, and we're spending not to my satisfaction all the time, but in an improving way, the money that we have. And as far as continuity of defense policy is concerned, you mentioned the counter-ISIL campaign. The counter-ISIL campaign is basically the campaign that we embarked on a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. You see it unfolding. It was Mosul. It was Raqqa. Mosul will fall shortly. Raqqa will fall. Those are essential because it is necessary to destroy ISIL where it arose and to destroy the fact and the idea that there can be a state based upon this ideology. That is necessary. It's not sufficient because you still have homegrown people and inspired people and people in other parts of the world, but it is necessary to get that done. That is continuing, and I'm very pleased, I'm extremely pleased that that's good because I don't know a good alternative or I would have proposed it. I hope that everyone continues to, I used to use the word accelerate, to accelerate it. Anytime we think of another way of doing things, we ought to go on and do that. And there's one last thing. I just saw Jim Mattis out at the Shangri-La Dialogue out in the Pacific, and John McCain, who gave a speech in Sydney, Australia. Before that's exactly what I would say. And not only that, that's exactly what American presidents and secretaries of state and secretaries of defense have said for decades, which is the Asia Pacific is peaceful and prosperous, and that's not an accident. It happened because of the pivotal role that American military power played in that region, and we need to keep that going. So there's continuity. Now, I can't be sure that that'll keep up. As Condi says, it's early in the administration. You don't know. But I certainly hope it does, because I know that those are the right things to do for our country and our security.
Condi, let me pick up on something Ash talked about. In the president's budget, I think he adds about $54 billion to defense, but he cuts dramatically foreign aid and the State Department. So you have this whole issue of our, of military and diplomacy. I think it was Jim Mattis that said, if you're gonna cut diplomacy, you better buy me more bullets. What's your reaction to the cuts?
Well, as we know, this is an opening bid. As a matter of fact, it's more of a statement than it is a budget. And this is going to be an iterative process with the Congress, and I doubt very seriously that the budget's going to look this way when it actually comes out. On the State Department side, obviously, I don't think the cuts at the levels that they are in that piece of paper are possible. I will say, though, that the State Department could use some reorganization and reform. I've never seen an organization that couldn't. I was Stanford's provost, and that meant I was the budget officer. And people were always horrified when you said we're actually going to have to make some cuts in budget. Just as an example, the State Department now appears to be about 75,000 people. That's about 15,000 more than when I was there, so I kind of wonder what's happened in that number. I also think that there are probably some, just management things. When I became Secretary of State, we had 70 phone contracts, 7-0. I said, there aren't 70 providers. How can we have 70 phone contracts? Well, everybody had their own little phone. So I'm sure there are a lot of things. And Rex Tillerson, who was an outstanding CEO as head of Exxon and had to watch costs, can do a lot. Now, that said, I hope that this will be done with a scalpel, not with a bludgeon, because there are some very important programs some to support the state building in places where we're trying to keep terrorists out, because you can push the terrorists out, but if things don't calm down in terms of governance and the economy, they will be back the next week. Some of it is related to helping countries that are trying to be more democratic, which, by the way, the more democracies, the better. Democracies don't fight each other. Democracies don't send child soldiers into battle as young as 10 years old. They don't harbor terrorists. They don't traffic women into the sex trade. And so some of the programs are that. But in many ways, our most amazing programs are ones that show American compassion, like AIDS relief, where we've saved millions of people from a pandemic in Africa. Malaria relief, where we've said America is a powerful country, but we've always been also a compassionate country, and we need to show that. Now, when you ask most Americans, they've done these polls, people think as much as 25 or 26% of the federal budget goes to foreign assistance. In fact, it is less than 1.5%, and about half of that 1.5% goes to so-called strategic policy, like supporting Israel and Egypt and the like. So I would not be one who said, don't look at the budget. Just one other little point. When I became secretary, we had as many foreign service officers in Germany as we had in India, and which one with 1 billion people, one with 80 million people, because the epicenter of the Cold War had been Germany. So there's lots you can do to make the State Department more efficient and so forth. But if you cut some of these programs that have ultimately made us safer because they've created decent governments elsewhere, we are going to be getting more bullets because we're going to have more trouble in the world.
Okay, this is the pitch for the book.
Thank you.
Democracy. It's a bestseller, and in it you conclude that the work of democracy is not done, and that we have to work to make our democracy truer and just for us, but we also have to make it truer and just for all mankind, humankind. Unfortunately, we live at a time that you also point out where we have the so-called four horsemen of the apocalypse: populism, nativism, protectionism, isolationism, that are still riding around in parts of the world. So how can you promote democratic principles in a world where there is this backlash?
Well, the first thing is to recognize, or to state loudly, that democracy is a superior form of government. It is the only form of government, by the way, where you can change your leaders peacefully. That's why authoritarians are frightened of their own people. As I said, the democracies tend to behave better in the world. And ultimately, if we believe that these values are universal, endowed by a creator, we're either living a lie or they actually should be universal for others too. And I experienced this as a kid. Maybe one reason I'm so attracted to this and so powerfully defensive of democracy is I grew up in segregated Birmingham, Alabama, where my parents couldn't take me to a movie theater or to a restaurant. We were second-class citizens. And I remember a particular afternoon, I was coming home from school with my Uncle Alto, and I was about 6-ish. And it was election day in Alabama. And this man named George Wallace was on the ballot to become governor of Alabama. And there were long, long lines of black people voting. And I said to my uncle, well, in my own 6-year-old way, I knew that George Wallace wasn't good for black people. So I said, well, if all those people are voting, he can't possibly win. And my uncle said, no. He said, we're still a minority, and he's going to win. And I looked at my uncle and I said, so why do they bother? And my uncle said, because they know that one day that vote will matter. Promotion of democracy is a moral cause as well as a practical one. And by the way, I've heard this, you can't impose democracy. You impose tyranny. There are few people in the world who would say they don't want to be able to say what they think, worship as they please, be free from the knock of the secret police at night, and choose those who would govern them. And we're not saying, let's impose that on others. We're saying to leaders who don't govern democratically, don't impose your will on your own people. And so I prefer the words democracy support to democracy promotion, because sometimes It's just all the time. It's just supporting those people who are trying to gain the same rights that we have.
Let me follow up on that with a reflection of what you're saying. Obviously occurred with the Arab Spring. Ash, you and I were in the administration when the Arab Spring occurred, and you had countries, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, all were acting to try to take down tyrannies within their own countries. But the result in most cases were failed states. And those failed states have now become breeding grounds for terrorists. I guess the question to both of you, let me start with Ash. How could the U.S. have handled it better to avoid that kind of tragedy in terms of how these failed states develop?
Well, it is kind of the question of the last 15 years, because most of our military involvements, most of our troops who died or wounded in those kinds of wars, they're actually kind of various. Some of them were at our initiative. Others were where a situation was deteriorating anyway, and others, like Afghanistan, was just pure self-defense initially. So it's different. But I think the general answer to your question, Leon, is you do understand. I had a good friend of mine, the Israeli Defense Minister Bughi Ya'alon, who said to me, "It's easy to make an omelet out of an egg, but it's impossible to make an egg out of an omelet." And in other words, when you take a society apart in the process of democratization, which can be a desirable way to go, and you create the failed state, or you create a situation that is lawless, it can be impossible to recover from that. Now, we're getting a lot better at that. I think not just the military, but the State Department and others at helping people make that transition. But I think you have to go in with a very realistic perspective, which is it is a long-term commitment. It is one that is best if you have others working with you, because they multiply the resources and they do less to focus the population on the idea that this is an American thing. So all those are good, but we've learned a lot over the last 15 years. But I do think one has to look at these things with caution, because it's so hard to put the egg back together.
Condi?
You know, let me pick up on something Ash said and say it a little bit, maybe a little bit differently. Iraq and Afghanistan were not democracy promotion. Iraq and Afghanistan were security issues that we tried to solve by military force. Iraq, we were wrong about the weapons of mass destruction, but he had been a cancer in the region, had invaded his neighbors. We thought it was time to deal with him. Afghanistan was pure self-defense, deal with the safe haven for al-Qaeda after 9/11. I would never have said to President Bush, let's use American military power to bring democracy to Iraq and Afghanistan. That would have been a misuse of American military power. You used American military power to deal with the security issue. Now, once you have overthrown the Taliban and Saddam Hussein for security reasons, you have to make a choice, because you now have responsibility to those countries. And it's the worst of circumstances, because these tyrannical cult of personalities, there's nothing underneath. There are no institutions underneath. Same with Libya, with the overthrow of Gaddafi. And so we decided in Afghanistan and Iraq that we were best off to try to give them a chance to build a democratic state. But it's a long process. It's very hard, particularly when there are no institutions, because the Saddam Husseins of the world don't allow institutions to be created under them. You know, totalitarian regimes, totalitario, which is Mussolini's name, word for it. Think of Joseph Stalin's Russia, Soviet Union. Prokofiev and Shostakovich are persecuted for not writing music that's socialist enough. There is not a single part of the life of the country that isn't serving the state. So these are extremely stressing cases. Now, if you look at the Arab Spring, two things come to mind. First of all, Tunisia has done better than others, and there's a reason for that. Tunisia had institutions that were ready to take over when this democratic opening came. They had a nationwide labor movement, for instance. They had a strong civil society of women's groups. So the Islamists in Tunisia had to compete and work with other groups, and that's why Tunisia doesn't look like Egypt. Mubarak in Egypt had destroyed all liberal forces. So of course the only organized forces were the Muslim Brotherhood, which then tried to have a democratic coup. So my point is, these are very different circumstances, but there's one lesson. It's going to be a lot easier if there are some kinds of institutions in place when this opening comes. And part of the work of democracy building is to start before the democratic opening comes. Help parties to develop, help a free press to develop, help women's groups to develop. You get better results when that opening comes. But one reason I wanted to write about this was Americans have become extremely allergic to the idea of democracy promotion because we associate it with Afghanistan and Iraq. Yeah. Most of it is not at all like that, and that I hope we will take into our future efforts.
And that's where the term nation building came in. And, right. But the fact is, helping to establish those institutions is critical to what you just said.
And hard.
Okay, but before I go into some of these flashpoints that are around the world, and we'll do it with the questions from the audience, I did want to ask about, none of us have served with presidents who tweet.
No, thank goodness.
But you said in the book, and I think it's true, that words matter, no matter how you say it. How can the United States implement some kind of consistent foreign policy when a president tweets his personal thoughts out to the world? How do you deal with that?
Well, it's really hard. Look, the president is going to use social media because he believes it's in his interest to do so. I hope that on the foreign policy side, there's a recognition, and you've seen it some on the foreign policy side, that if the president is going to use that medium, it needs to be strategic. Do it when you have something that you want to say to move policies forward, to influence others, and that takes a certain discipline that is not yet there, but might still get there. But if I can just say, it's not just the president, Leon. Okay. Everybody's tweeting now. Mm-hmm. In your old institution, Congress, before anybody's talked to their colleagues and tried to come to some compromise, people are out tweeting their views. And now everybody's locked into a position. So social media is challenging to democracy, quite apart from the president, is challenging to democracy because democracy takes time. You have to have time to talk, to compromise, to think, to find interest overlap. And if the first thing you do is out there with your first thoughts, you've got a problem. So I think social media is challenging in general, not just with the president's tweeting.
Ash, tweeting.
Well, it is unprecedented, and that by itself, I don't think would be hard to have a complete thought within it in that format. But the real issue comes when there is a discrepancy between what the president has said and what some other official has said, or what has been said and what is done. And how do people react to that? I see them reacting around the world, and they ask me this question all the time. And there are two ways it can go. One is to discount what the president tweets or says, and the other is to discount what America seems to be doing or what other officials are doing. Neither of those is good for us. And so the consistency is really essential to having a policy of purpose. And I noticed the financial markets have, at the beginning of the administration, they would react to the president's tweets. But as the months went by, they have ceased to do that in the area on either side. I don't want them discounting what the president says. I don't want them discounting what all his officials said and what the policy appears to be on the ground. So you've got this question of clarity and consistency is something that every new administration has. This is a particularly serious case of it, both because of the tweeting and just in the nature of things. But we're not going to get what we need to get from our foreign policy if we can't be clear and consistent.
Yeah, I think we can all agree he needs a strong chief of staff.
He's available. He's available.
We're at the point where we're going to turn to the questions from the audience. But again, I'd like to take a moment to recognize our question review team. These are the people who select the questions that will be presented to our speakers. And I'd ask you to hold your applause until I introduce them. Fran Gaver, who's our veteran question review team member. Doug McKnight, reporter from KAZU Radio. Claudia Melendez-Salinas, who's the education reporter for the Monterey Herald. And Amy Wu, who is the government and political reporter for the Salinas, California. Would you thank them, please? And Sylvia and I, again, want to take this moment along with the Panetta Institute Board of Directors to say how grateful we are to all of our sponsors and supporters. As you know, we are celebrating our 20th anniversary this year, and this achievement, frankly, would not be possible without your help. So please give sponsors and supporters a hand too. Okay, Russian expert here. I want to ask you, before we get into our questions, what the hell is Putin after? Does he want to restore the old Soviet Union, destabilize the U.S., destabilize Europe, all of the above? How do we best deal with this guy?
Right. Well, I'll just tell you a little story, a little vignette, and I think it will answer the first question, what's he up to? So I'm a Russianist, and at one point he kind of liked me because I was a Russianist. I don't think that's probably still the case, but in any case, once we were talking, and he said, Condi, you know us. Russia has only been great when it's been ruled by great men, like Peter the Great and Alexander II. Now, at that point, there's that little voice in your brain that wants to say, and do you mean Vladimir the Great? But of course you wouldn't say that because that would be rude, so I didn't. But that's who he thinks he is. He thinks he's reuniting the Russian people in greatness. He's wrapped himself in nationalism, orthodoxy, anti-Westernism. He's avenging the end of the Cold War. He says that it was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century that the Soviet Union collapsed. That's quite something for a country that lost 25 million people in World War II. And it's too bad if that means you have to take territory from a neighbor like Ukraine or fly bomber runs along the coast of Sweden. I mean, what's Sweden done to the Russians in the last 300 years or so? Or, if you have to threaten American allies. And certainly, if you can weaken Europe, that's a very big, important part of this, and break the transatlantic link. So all of that, I think, is a part of both a kind of vengeful policy and one that seeks to reassert Russian greatness. The problem with reasserting Russian greatness is it is being reasserted the old-fashioned way, military power, domination, because when is the last time you bought a product made in Russia that wasn't from petroleum? So what do they have in the international system? It's their military power and their will, and he has demonstrated that you can play a weak hand pretty well if you have will. Now, how to deal with it? You have to stand up to it. I think that the work that the two of you did in your respective terms as Secretary of Defense to reinforce our NATO allies with rotating forces so that there's a very clear message to Putin, don't go any further. Article 5, an attack upon one, an attack upon all matters. I think increases in the defense budget help. But I think I would personally arm the Ukrainians. I think to raise the cost to the Russians of what they're doing in Ukraine. And by the way, there's a low-level, everyday conflict going on in eastern Ukraine that is keeping it unstable. It's not on your front pages, but it's going on with Russian separatists who are backed by the Russian military. So you've got to stand up to him because he respects strength. Now, let me just say one final thing. There are things we can cooperate with the Russians on. Unfortunately, because we didn't act in Syria 4 or 5 years ago, we have no leverage in that conflict. The Russians did act. We can say until we're blue in the face, Assad must go. We can't do anything about it. But if the Russians become convinced, Vladimir Putin is not a sentimental man. If they become convinced that Assad must go, he will go. And I think one of the things that the administration is trying to do, when Rex Tillerson went to Moscow and said, given what the Syrians have done in the use of chemical weapons, you are either complicit or incompetent in what you did with that agreement that you did is to get the Russians to see that maybe they don't want Assad for the long run, because ultimately a peace in Syria is going to have to come through Moscow. The only other place that we might cooperate is North Korea. We'll get to that. But if a North Korean long-range missile can reach Alaska, it can reach Vladivostok.
Okay.
Leon, can I just add?
Go ahead.
I think Leon and I were reminiscing earlier about first meeting Vladimir Putin in the 1990s. I always say, people say, do you know what's going on in his head? And I always say, just listen to what comes out of his mouth. Because he says exactly what he's thinking. And it is exactly what Condi says. And, you know, in power relations in general, you try to work with another country where you can and where you can make your interests align or overlap, and where you can't, you don't. And with Russia, not only have those areas where we've been able to align our interests narrowed over the time of Vladimir Putin's presidency, but the thing I wanted to say is there's one way in which he defines Russian success, which makes it impossible to align with it, which is as our failure. And if there's somebody whose the essence of their policy is to thwart yours, it's a little hard to build a bridge to that motivation. And that is why we try with North Korea, we try a little bit with Iran, but in Syria, Ukraine, and so forth, the only thing to do is to stand strong. And we're going to need to do that for a time until, it's not going to happen soon, Vladimir Putin passes from the scene, or I consider this unlikely, he changes what is really a fundamental part of his mindset.
Yeah, actually, let me ask you. It's one of our questions here. Can North Korea be worked with through diplomacy, or are they beyond any reasonable approach? And in discussing that, I think it's worth discussing China and whether or not our effort to try to convince China to play a role in dealing with North Korea is getting anywhere, or is that a waste of time?
Well, I'll tell you a little story about that. In 1994, I spent about half my time that year planning a strike on the Yongbyon reactor in North Korea in the Defense Department, because we thought they were about to unload the reactor, and we were prepared to do that. And we didn't do that. And later in that decade, we made a diplomatic effort when they halted their program. And I went to Pyongyang, which is a really crazy place to be, particularly if you're in defense background. And so I've seen a lot of turns of this wheel, and there have been, and the common denominators, and you see it coming up again today, and people are talking about it, including the president, and I very much understand it, is looking at it and saying, well, listen, we understand they hate us, right? They're very open, the North Koreans are about that, and the Americans and their people, but they are abjectly dependent upon China. So why is it that China can't turn this around? And doesn't China see the writing on the wall here, which is a growing danger created by this little Disneyland, which is on their very own border and over which they have unique leverage. So the puzzle has always been, why don't the Chinese do more? And here's why I don't think the Chinese do more. They, like the frog in the heating pot of water, don't jump because they fear more either the collapse of North Korea, which they induce if they apply pressure, or a war which they know we will win. You know that war very well. We planned that for 50 years. We know exactly what we're doing. There's no question that we will destroy the North Korean armed forces and the regime, but it is an intensity of violence, the likes of which the world has not seen in half a century. I mean, so it's not something easy to get into. And they know that it will end with a unified Korean peninsula allied with the victorious United States. And they fear that. So they fear collapse, and they fear a circumstance which ends up with us on their border. Those are the reasons why the Chinese haven't jumped. Now, there may be some ways diplomatically that we can address those things, but you also have to there's so much attention on China at this moment. Don't forget South Korea and Japan, because there's not going to be any final solution, diplomatic or any otherwise, without the Republic of Korea. They have to agree, otherwise there'll be a spoiler to it. And there obviously is no war on the Korean Peninsula that doesn't involve the South Korean people in the most elemental and difficult sort of way. And Japan has a history with the North Koreans, and so that's why it ends up being a number of people involved. So because I'm pessimistic about the Chinese, Leon, changing this motivation, even though you can tell them until they're blue in the face that you think that that's the wrong discount rate to be applying to this circumstance, they're doing it anyway. And even if we could line them up, I don't think it's very likely we'll simultaneously line up the South Koreans and the Japanese. I think for the time being, we're deterrence and defense. We've really got to keep our eye on those things. And that's why the missile defenses are important. That's why 28,500 troops on the Korean Peninsula. I wish I had a way to get out of that, but deterrence and defense is number one now. I don't mind people continuing to take a run at this diplomatic thing. I'm just giving you my assessment. I'm not optimistic.
What do you think?
I agree, but the reason we need it, we tried to align these at the same table. We made some progress, but that was with his father. And Ash, I agree with you about deterrence and defense, but one thing worries me. And that is, I don't think Kim Jong-un is really as stable as his father was. And that's
his grandfather.
And one of the reason I think the Chinese worry is he's not just potentially slightly unhinged, he's reckless. This is somebody who reached into Malaysia to kill his half-brother who was under Chinese protection. And so I don't know that an American president can tolerate, and I don't mean Donald Trump, I mean an American president, any American president, can tolerate the circumstance in which a slightly unhinged, reckless North Korean leader has a nuclear weapon capable of reaching the United States. And I don't know if that is a 3-year proposition or a 4-year proposition, but it's not a 10-year proposition. Mm-hmm. And so I think the hand's going to be forced somewhere along the way. And I think what they're probably saying to the Chinese is, you want to avoid that war, then you better take the other choice, and we'll sort out what happens there. Because I just don't think it's. I think we're in equilibrium.
I think that's right. But the answer is the same in both cases, yes, because it is the forces that I'm calling deterrent forces, right, that would overthrow the North Korean regime. And defense, we're going to have to do. It's important to have them because it doesn't go quickly. And he'll unload some of what he has in the early days of a war, if one were to start. And we need to protect ourselves and our people, and our friends and allies from that, and our troops. And so you got to have that ingredient. But I think Condi's right. If you despair, as I do, or I don't consider the diplomatic path likely, we don't have to boil in the pot. But then it's a tall order because you are talking about substantial.
No, but I think Condi's right that if you get to a point where they've got an intercontinental ballistic missile and a miniaturized nuclear weapon that they can put on top of that, somebody's going to have to act.
Yeah. This is the single most dangerous situation, I think, in the world today.
Let's turn to terrorism and two questions that are related. How safe is the U.S. from a new generation of terrorists, and how can we improve our strengths? This is to you, Dr. Rice. Many young people, including my daughter, who will be graduating from college in 2 weeks, have expressed deep concern for the safety of our country in the wake of increased terrorist attacks on innocent citizens. What positive encouragement and advice can you offer as they go out in the world?
Well, it's the problem that we have now. I actually think we managed to destroy the Al-Qaeda organization that did 9/11. That organization doesn't exist anymore. It's metastasized into some places, and ISIS has metastasized into some places. But the hardest threat really is what people are calling the lone wolf or homegrown threat. We're going to have to look. The long pole in the tent is you're trying to stop an attack. So information is the most important thing that you can do, and getting to the place that communities will not allow terrorists to plot and plan without alerting authorities. It's absolutely critical. Getting to the place that we have the resources, you were saying earlier, to vet people who are trying to come into the country. Getting to the place that perhaps we tolerate some invasion of social media, of people who are behaving strangely, so that we know what they're plotting and planning. Those are all very difficult choices from the point of view of a privacy and civil liberties concern. But they're also absolutely necessary to protecting the country. And if I could just say one thing about that. People say, how do you balance security and privacy? Well, actually, we balance it across our three branches of government. So the president is always going to be a little bit more oriented toward the security side. If you don't believe it, look at a constitutional lawyer named Barack Obama, who ended up mostly fighting George W. Bush's war on terror. The Congress can step back and make laws, authorize and not authorize the Patriot Act and so forth, and the courts ultimately determine constitutionality. So I think Americans should be comfortable that our privacy is protected. The issue is, as we protect our privacy, how do we also protect our security? It's difficult, but I think internal, homegrown, is the hardest part.
Let me ask you something in responding to that, Ash. With what's going on in Mosul, and we're, I think, maybe a few months away from winning in Mosul, and we're going after Raqqa, is the likelihood of London-type attacks by ISIS growing that much greater?
I think that the destruction of ISIL in Iraq and Syria is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It is necessary because, as I said, the idea has to be shown to be a loser. And so when even if you're a homegrown lost soul or sociopath and you go online, you're not going to get frizzed up by the picture of what you see. You're going to see a picture of defeat and a movement tripping off the edge of history. That's the image that needs to be created there. That's necessary, and I think it's a very important step. And you're right, Mosul will fall and Raqqa will fall. I'm confident of it, and I think that's extremely important. That doesn't end there. We still have issues in Libya and Afghanistan, other places in Iraq and Syria. You have the Syrian civil war going on. There's a lot to do. And so I think they contribute to the homegrown, but I just don't want to associate myself with everything Condi said. A lot of this is going to be a home
lone
field,
wolf type
home field. Let me just say something a little bit more long term, though. There may come a time when this particular form of, I'll call it Islamist, that is, people who claim to be inspired by Islam, as the principal terrorist movement worldwide, not the only one. When that is sufficiently suppressed. And I don't believe that's the end of terrorism, I'm sad to say. I think those of us who have the business, who've been in the business, and our successors who are in the business of protecting our people and providing that most elemental thing, which is the security of our people, are going to have to be preoccupied with terrorism for a very long time. And the reasons at that time have nothing to do with any religion at all or any particular movement. They have to do with the fact that destructive power that used to be only available to large groups of people in nation states is falling into smaller and smaller, in the hands of smaller and smaller groups. And so there are the means there, and there are always going to be people who are aberrant in some manner, and we're going to have to protect the many against the few. And I'm sorry to say that in defense and intelligence and diplomacy and so forth, I'd like to say that this won't be a lasting thing. I think it is possible, though, and necessary to protect our people. And for their institutions, they pay for us, and that's what we're for. We're supposed to provide them protection. So I don't accept that we can't most of the time and that they can't have the experience that they are basically safe. We owe them that. We need to deliver that at home and overseas.
Okay, this month is the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War. Do you see any possibility of peace between Israel and the Palestinians? Is the two-state solution dead?
The two-state solution is the only solution ultimately, and it's the only solution for a democratic, so that there can be a Jewish democratic state of Israel. The Palestinians are going to have to be in a position to self-govern. And the demographics are not on the side of either, because the most radical elements of the Palestinians are the ones that are having lots of children. Haniya, who was the Hamas prime minister at one point, had 13 sisters and brothers, and he had 11 kids. And on the Israeli side, it's ultra-Orthodox and settler communities that are multiplying. And so you've got demographics going against you, and you've got a problem. But I'm going to say something that's maybe a bit provocative and a bit counterintuitive. I think the real work has to be done on the Palestinian side. I fully understand that the Israelis build settlements. Look, I used to go there, and they'd always announce some housing settlement just as I was leaving, and it made me mad as a hatter, because I was there trying to bring peace, and they seemed to be trying to embarrass me. So I know how hard it is to deal with the Israelis. But the Israelis are our allies. They're democratic, and they have offered the Palestinians several times deals that they should have taken. The most recent was with Ehud Olmert in November of 2008, when there was a fully articulated deal. The Palestinians were unable to take it, I think because they've not really been truthful with their own people about what a deal is going to look like. 4 million Palestinian refugees are not going to have the right to return to Israel. Not going to happen. And yet they haven't been able to give up on that myth. There's still too many maps that don't show Israel in a Palestinian classroom. Because Israel is an open democratic society, there are Israelis in peace parties as well as Israelis who are hardcore and over. You don't have that range in the Palestinian territories. And so I think we have work to do with the Palestinians for better governance. We trained security forces. We started in the Bush administration training Palestinian security forces using American military, the generals. You continued those programs. So we need to lay the groundwork for the Palestinians, but ultimately the Palestinians are going to need to take a deal. And as much as I know that there are barriers on the other side, that's where I think the real work has to be done.
All right.
I agree with that.
Ash, are the DoD and services investing enough in basic research to assure we are staying ahead of our adversaries in the field of cyber and artificial intelligence capability?
I'm not happy with the trajectory there, Leon, but I don't think the raw dollars are the biggest variable there. The truth is that we in the Defense Department spent a tremendous amount of our innovative energy over the last 15 years on counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. I think we did that extremely well. That is, performed extremely well. Whatever you thought about the various campaigns we were waging, they were well done, but they were all absorbing. And you know, and I know that when you're in war like that, it is, and your people, your service people are in harm's way every day. That is preoccupying in a very substantial way. During that time, we didn't do everything that I would like us to have done to keep up in technology with respect to what we call high-end potential opponents like China and Russia. And deterrence hinges upon us having, and it being clear that we have the capabilities that can easily counter theirs. And we lost ground over those 15 years in that regard. I think we need to make up some of that ground, and so money isn't the only dimension of it. The other thing I'd say, which is very important to me, and being out here in California is particularly important, is that when I was coming up, I'm a physicist, so when I came up in this business, and the people who were my mentors and my seniors were people who had worked in World War II or the immediate Cold War period. And they taught me that a scientist had some obligation to take an interest in and contribute to the solution of human problems, and especially defense, where my field had made so much of a contribution. So it was kind of bred into me. And I mean, Condi also, I think we kind of fell into this mission area over time when we were young, and have tried to contribute to it ever since. But we need to rebuild those kind of bridges between that which is the greatest source of American strength fundamentally, which is our innovative culture, our technological strength, our risk capital system, and national purpose. And that's another thing that I think we need to work on. So it's not just money, but remember, we're spending $7,200 billion a year, which is more than Google, Apple, and Amazon, more than twice what they spend combined in a given year. So the Defense Department is still the big dog, and we do a lot in cyber and other fields. It's not all a matter of money.
Let me ask you, in looking at the future, Russia obviously has learned a lot from its capability with cyber, as we saw in the election cycle last year. But they've been using it elsewhere. France, Germany, other places as well. Is the new form of hybrid war going to be the model for the future, where you use cyber, you use false news, and you use these individuals who...
Little green men.
Yeah, little green men. As they did in the Ukraine,
yes,
to basically create instability. You're not winning anything, but you sure as hell are creating instability.
It is the model.
Is that the model?
It is the model, or the Russian model, in Europe especially, and it does create a problem for traditionally minded people between war and peace. Now, I'm of a simple mind, and I think an attack is an attack. But when somebody attacks you with cyber, there are still people who are going to debate whether that's cyber or not. And I think that even as Condi mentioned this, we are beefing up our defenses in Europe, and really for the first time in 25 years, drawing up war plans for NATO. We didn't have those for 25 years. We didn't need them. And we're procuring the equipment for that. The way that is likely to unfold, if God forbid it does, is not the way it was during the Cold War, where tanks rolled over the German border. It'll start, at least, in a very different way. And hybrid warfare is the phrase people use, but I think it means we need a new playbook. And a lot of people think when they go back to Russia, not YouTube, but other people say, well, we need to redo what we did during the Cold War. No, we need a new playbook that recognizes that this is the nature of warfare as the Russians understand. They're very good at it.
Just on the cyber point, I sort of hoped when the 150 or so countries were attacked in that massive attack, China, everybody, that maybe there was a little opening that people would have said, maybe some kind of international conversation about what's permissible here and what isn't. Because when you think about it, the way we survived the nuclear age was mutually assured destruction. An attack upon, if you attack me, I can do the same to you. But we also found that sort of unsatisfying. And after a while, we started to get, with the Russians in particular, the Soviets, rules of the game and inspections and hotlines and ways to mitigate against accident or because we didn't want to annihilate each other. That attack seemed to me just the sort of tip of the iceberg of what a real annihilation could look like from cyber, because you had, the Russians were apparently extremely hard hit. So I am not a believer that we're going to do much along the international cooperation front in cyber for a while, but it's just because we may not succeed, it's not a reason to try. At some level, we're all vulnerable to these tools, and it might be something that we should try and have discussions.
Connie, let me ask you this. If you were Secretary of State last year and you saw what the Russians were doing to try to interfere with our election process, and let's remember, I guess, the first information came in June, July, August of last year, and you're Secretary of State, and you see them doing this, what would you have recommended to the President?
Well, I believe in blowing the whistle, say it. If you have real evidence, say it. Because I think we're in the worst circumstance now, which is that it's leaking out in dribs and drabs what they did do, what they might not have done, what the effects might have been. I couldn't watch the interview with Vladimir Putin last night. I just couldn't do it. I decided to read it because the smugness and the sense that I've got America all in turmoil, that's what he wants. And while I might have blown the whistle on them, I think I would have said, we know what you're doing. We have evidence that you're doing it. And at a time of our choosing, we will retaliate. But you know what? We're confident in our institutions. We're confident in our electoral processes. Now go away. Because he gets satisfaction out of the sense of disturbing things and the uncertainty that he's creating and the like. And so I think we needed a more confident response, and probably, from my point of view, a more public response.
When, we talked about this, but I don't think it's ever been defined. When is a cyber attack an act of war?
Well, it's an attack. It's an attack when our people are hurt. I say an act of war turned out to be a sort of legal term.
Maybe
an attack is an attack.
Let's assume there's a cyber
if you come
attack.
in and you do damage to the American people, and just because you do it by cyber, to me, it's incidental that it was cyber. It is an attack upon the United States. I think we should regard it that way in our defense planning. That doesn't mean we're automatically going to retaliate, but it doesn't mean that you declare it not an attack, or you confine yourself to responding to it through cyber. I think somebody who attacks the United States needs to understand that they may be inviting all kinds of responses that draw on our full power. And if they try to exploit our vulnerabilities, as the Putin interview shows he is doing, well, two can play that game. And I think the real consequence of a public confrontation inevitably leads to the fact that people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. And the thing he fears most is that the Arab Spring will come to Moscow.
Which, by the way, I think some of his motivation was exactly that. He is an eye for an eye kind of guy.
Yeah.
And in 2012, we called his election fraudulent, which it was. It was Hillary Clinton who called it fraudulent on behalf of the United States. And now he was going to demonstrate that our election was fraudulent too. And that's a reason that I think you have to back him off. I will tell my little story about dealing with him, because I think it's this. So back in 2007, I was secretary, and we were trying to get the OAS involved in Venezuela. By the way, if you want to watch a real crisis unfolding, Venezuela, which is awful. It's a middle-income country now where people can't find food or medicine. But in any case, the Russians flew bear bombers, unarmed bear bombers, down the coast of Latin America to demonstrate solidarity with the Venezuelans, with Hugo Chavez. And I called President Bush and I said, I'm a Russianist. There's something I want to say. And he said, okay. So I went out and I said, the Russians understand, I'm sure, that flying unarmed bear bombers that are older than I am down the coast of Latin America does not change the correlation of forces. Now, correlation of forces is their word. So Bob Gates calls and he says, oh, I'd like to say something too. And he says, but we are prepared to fly search and rescue missions should those bombers crash given their advanced age. At that point, no more bomber runs. Sometimes you have to call the Russians on the absurdity of what they're doing, and it's sometimes your best defense.
Remember that story. That's a good one.
You know, I get this question all the time, so I enjoy asking you guys the same question, which is, you know, considering all of these flashpoints that we talked about and what's happening around the world, what is it that keeps you awake at night?
I get asked I'll go first. I get asked it all the time. And I got two things to say about that, Leon. The first is that I wish I could skinny it down, but you mentioned it. We haven't talked about all of them, but terrorism, North Korea, Russia, China, we haven't really talked about that, and Iran. And that's just now. And then we have to worry about tomorrow, too, an uncertain future, because we've never really been. And so I would like to be able to tell you one thing that keeps you up. But I used to tell people this as Secretary of Defense, and I think it's very important. I said, but I'm up so that you don't have to be up. And you want to know why you $600 billion a year. We're supposed to protect you, and you're supposed to be able to sleep okay. So I'm supposed to be up, and you're supposed to be sleeping. That's what it's about. That's what an effective defense, with the minimum dollars possible and the minimum loss of life of American service members possible. That's what we're supposed to do.
Yeah. And now you can sleep at night because you're at Harvard again. Yes. All of those places are to worry about. But the single thing I worry most is that America will not have the energy and confidence to be the glue that we've been for 70 years. The systems operator, as someone said, because the international system doesn't operate itself. It is lawless without a country that is willing to defend certain values, defend certain interests. It was never that people did what the United States said we wanted them to do, but they had to take into consideration what we wanted them to do. And that in itself had a kind of salutary effect on peace and security. And I just hope as we go forward, we'll not forget what an extraordinary run this 70 years has been. It's not that there haven't been conflicts. It's not that there haven't been a lot of lost lives. There have. But if you look at the grand history of humankind, this period of American leadership has been extraordinary from the point of view of prosperity and peace, particularly among the great powers. And I just hope we're going to remain confident enough to continue to be that glue, because without us, it's going to be a very ugly world for our interests and for our values.
Well, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, obviously a lot of challenges that we're facing in the world, and a lot of concerns about how we face those challenges. But I remain supremely confident about the ability of the United States to survive, not because of Washington alone. I'm more convinced that the resilience and common sense and spirit of the American people and your dedication to doing what's right is what will drive our democracy and what will drive our future. So thank you for coming, and thank you for participating.